Tell Me More podcast is being recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. This episode discusses topics around child sexual abuse, depression, and self-harm. Please take care when listening. If you or anyone you know needs support, we have provided links for resources in the show notes. Today we are talking about a really important topic that people usually shy away from. Our amazing guest, Emma Harkinson, is a survivor of child sexual abuse, and she bravely uses her experience to help educate others and protect children. Emma works as a survivor consultant to Australian Childhood Foundation. She is also an author and the founding director of a not-for-profit. But today she is here to tell us more about her campaign to protect children from abuse. My name is Olivia Molly Rogers, and I'm excited to get comfortable in the uncomfortable with you and remind you that nobody is perfect and everybody has something going on behind the scenes that you may not know about. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Emma, thank you for joining me. I feel like this has been a long time coming and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You have so many passions, and you told me before that you work 7.5 days a week, which...
Technically, in reality, no.
Well, you cram a lot into your life, so you're passionate about so many things. Can you tell me what it is that drives you and, gets you up and going?
I think, and this is kind of a boring answer, but I think it's duty a little bit. I think that despite having had some real disadvantage that we're going to talk about, I'm also incredibly privileged, and I feel like having experienced some kind of trauma and suffering, it makes you more aware of all of the other trauma and suffering in the world, whether that's a child, an animal, a worker. And so that experience has just kind of driven me to be like, everyone deserves to live a safe, free life. And so I'm going to do what I can to make that happen within my little life.
That's incredible. You're very inspiring. Now, I would love to know a bit about your childhood and some happy memories.
Yeah, I was, if you can be both a shy and confident child, I think I was that. I had 2 dogs who I adored. I used to get all of my stuffed animals in a little circle and I would run their morning meetings. Probably learnt that from my mum, who had actual meetings.
That's so cute.
And I, was just interested in things, loved going to school, loved learning. I was doing really competitive gymnastics from a really young age. So I've always been a little intense in what I get into. But yeah, I just was doing things and enjoying them. I have a brother. He was my bestie, still is.
How close in age are you?
He's 3 years older.
Okay.
So we had a little period where he was like, I'm cooler than you. But most of the time, butts.
Yeah, that's cute. Now, we are going to talk about something difficult today, and I only want you to share what you feel comfortable with. I think it's so brave that you speak openly about your experiences in order to help other people. You've been open about the fact that you are a survivor of child abuse. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes. So from when I was about 9 years old, I was in a program that meant that I was left alone with an adult every week in a soundproofed room. And at first, I really liked this adult. I really liked the program. Everything was great. And then I went from being uncomfortable with this person to really hating this person. And that's because I was being sexually abused. And it started off, at a smaller scale, but it became a really severe form of sexual abuse. It was actually a woman who was abusing me. I think people have a massive kind of blind spot for the fact that while it's much less common, there are women who abuse little girls. And kind of a lot of my life unraveled from there because I didn't know how to understand what was happening, let alone kind of do anything beyond survive that. And so that continued until I was a couple years older. And at that point, I managed to kind of get myself out of that program, but I never said anything as to why I necessarily wanted to leave the program. I just knew that I you know, had this adult in my life that I was supposed to trust, supposed to respect, and she had betrayed that trust and respect in the worst way possible.
It's so horrible. I'm sorry that that happened to you. So you didn't tell anyone at the time?
No, the closest thing I ever did to disclosing that abuse at that time, because I did tell my psychiatrist and my parents when I was like 14, was I said that this person was weird. And for me, that was like a massive deal to be a young child going against an adult who you're told to respect and say, no, I think she's really weird and I don't like that program and I think it's boring and all of that, for me was really significant. So when my mum didn't pick up on that, like it just wasn't a thing for her, to the point that she doesn't ever remember me actually saying that. She just was like, oh, we think she's great. And so if that was the response, I was like, well, I won't be saying anything else then.
Yeah.
Because that was all I could do. And when my mum looks back, because we're really open about it now, she feels really sure that if I had said that a man was weird, that would have been an alarm bell for her. But she just never assumed that a woman could be doing something like that.
Probably just thought you meant that she was quirky or a bit different rather than
Yeah, exactly. Because
creepy.
Weird isn't necessarily like, I don't think weird should have a negative connotation necessarily.
Yeah.
And so she didn't take it that way. And that was, I meant a lot more than weird. I actually meant to say that I was really disgusted by her, that I hated her, and that I thought, like, my feelings about her were really strong, and I didn't think that children were allowed to have feelings that strong and that negative about an adult, because it would be disrespectful.
Yeah.
And I was always told that I was a really good girl, that I was a really good student, that I was a really good, you know, person, and I didn't want to compromise that kind of view that adults had of me.
You just wanted to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think in hindsight that there were indicators of what was going on with you that the adults in your life missed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first is that they missed that attempt of a disclosure. And I think that's because adults kind of expect children to come to them with this fully formed kind of disclosure. But I didn't understand. I didn't know what sexual abuse was. I couldn't comprehend what was happening to me. I think if a child goes from really loving the things that they do, the activities that they're a part of, to suddenly hating them, like that should be a red flag.
Yeah.
I wasn't just not liking that program. I didn't want to go to school at all. I didn't want to go to my other activities. I just kind of completely checked out. I wasn't interested in my friends. And that should be concerning in a way that is not just like, oh, something might have happened. And to be fair, like, I had a lot of other family traumas happening at the time, like deaths in the family, my grandma being diagnosed with cancer, my dog died, like a lot happened at once. And so it would be easy for adults to go, that's why. But there needs to be kind of digging into questions. And I think also later on, the thing that's really interesting is my parents actually did think that I had been sexually abused.
Really?
Once it had already finished, because that was when I started really unraveling. And if I ever saw them hug or kiss, I like lost my mind, because my idea of physical intimacy had become completely corrupted. So my idea of potentially my parents having sex was like horrifying to me. So I'd sleep in their bed every night because I didn't want that to happen, because sex was something that I completely misunderstood.
Yeah.
I also, you know, I saw like a little scene in Pretty Woman, that movie, and there's that scene where the character puts his hand on the lap of Julia Roberts' character, and I like screamed and lost my mind. And my parents were like, there's no way something hasn't happened to her, because it's such an over-the-top response. But when I was asked, was I sexually abused? I didn't really know what that meant.
Yeah.
I was asked if someone had hurt me, which was an attempt to use more child-friendly language. But to me, someone hurting you is like a schoolyard bully or someone pushing you over. What was happening to me, I didn't really associate with being hurt. I associated it with like violated, but that wasn't a word that I had yet. And so I said no. And so it's pretty hard to kind of deal with that when you have a child that just outright denies something. And to the point where I kept being asked because they were so sure of it. I started having my psychologist, my psychiatrist asking me, and I kept being like, why is everyone asking me this? Everyone leave me alone.
And they all asked in a similar sort of way?
Not necessarily all similar ways, but all ways that didn't allow me to think that what I wanted to talk about was the right thing to share. And so, yeah, it's hard. It's like, I think adults expect that if they ask that question, they'll get the answer that is true. And even more than that, they expect that children will come to them and tell them. And neither of those things should be assumed, because children are doing all they can to just like keep living. Like by the time I was 12, I was self-harming. I was having like dangerous thoughts that meant my mum wouldn't let me go to train stations anymore. I was medicated for depression and anxiety and OCD. Like, to put on top of that the weight of responsibility of going against an adult that everyone in your community loves, it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. That's a lot for a 12-year-old.
It's too much, yeah.
So you said that you told your parents and psychiatrist when you were 14.
So I actually told my psych, and I got her to tell my parents because I couldn't bear to say it. And I told her like incrementally. I would say a really small thing, and then the next session I'd say a little bit more, because I was terrified that she was going to think that I was insane, or that she wouldn't believe me, or that the response would not be what I was hoping for. And so I'd test the water, and then I had eventually, over all of these sessions, said enough that she said, I believe you, you've been sexually abused. Like, I need to tell your parents, we need to talk about this. Yeah. And my parents were hugely supportive. Like, I'm very lucky. A lot of people have family who either the family members are abusing them, it's the most common form of child sexual abuse, or they have family members that don't believe them. And so I was really lucky at least to have that.
Yeah. How do you think, without there being enough indicators potentially for the adults around you to know what was going on, how do you think they could have better protected you?
I think there are a few ways. I think that we need proactive child protection rather than just a reactive form where, like, if something seems bad with my child, I should check in with them. I think that if we had a way where, you know, adults were taught to consistently check in with kids and sort of look at all of the people in their life that they're close to and check in on like their level of trust, like literally you could have a trust scale and ask children to place them on it, then it's, if there's any change that's significant, that's something that you can be asking about. And it's also telling children that you're allowed to change that number and that that's acceptable, and that adults have to continually earn trust. It's not just a thing that they have to have because of their position of power. I also think that if adults gave like a code word to children, like zucchini or zorpal or whatever word you want to do, that basically means I have something to say that I can't comprehend, but it's a big deal, that puts the weight of responsibility onto the adult instead of the child. I think that would be really important. And I also think so many adults assume that it's not a problem that they're going to have to deal with, that so long as they have taught stranger danger to their child, if they have kept them in a safe environment, they'll be fine. Like, I went to a private school. I had so many privileges, but it still happened. Yeah. And it happens regardless of socioeconomic kind of situations. And so I think it's really important that all adults see themselves as a part of the need to protect children. Like, we have 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys being sexually abused in Australia. That means every single person knows someone who's survived child sexual abuse, multiple people. And if you're around children, or you work with children, or you have children, you know children that have been or are being sexually abused. So everyone has a responsibility to really actively engage in this discussion and try to fix that.
100%. It's, those stats make me feel physically sick. And I've been working with Australian Childhood Foundation, as you have, which is how we connected. And every time I have a conversation about it, it blows my mind, and I think everybody else's, because if you do live this a bit of a sheltered life and you haven't had conversations with someone who's experienced it, I think it is quite easy to sort of turn a blind eye and you know, not confront those facts. But the stats, you know,
there's, what is it, over 500,000 reports of child abuse in Australia every year.
And reports are like
Not
rare in themselves.
Yeah.
The amount of children who will never disclose. Like, I statistically am kind of an anomaly in that normally it's about 23 years before someone discloses having been sexually abused as a child. I'm 24 now, so that's quite different from what's usual. But that really shows like the level of discomfort that people have and how we really internalize it. Like, I felt that I had done something wrong, that because I felt disgusting at having been so violated, I was disgusting. All of this shame that belongs to the perpetrators is something that we really internalize. And I think that's why we hear so little about it. And that's why, even though I find it, you know, really quite difficult to talk about, it's why I think it's so important too, if I can.
Definitely. Because again, I think, you know, without people seeing or hearing from someone who has experienced it, they have an assumption that it's a certain type of person, certain type of situation, and not something that they would see, you know, within their circles.
Yeah. And there's a very classic, you know, the archetypal pedophile, and they look a certain way, and we have all of these kind of ideas from pop culture, and they're not really helpful. We have to assume, which is a really sad thing to say, but we have to assume that every adult could potentially be a perpetrator, because that is where we are.
I would love to know from you what you think are some effective strategies that we can give to caregivers, parents, you know, those key adults in a child's life to help.
I think there are a number of things that adults need to be able to do to effectively protect children. The first is to actually understand just how serious child abuse is, just how common it is, so that people are aware they actually really do need to be thinking about it. The next is they really need to understand what a child's rights are. I think we often almost don't consider children like whole humans because they're still developing, but that development isn't like a lack of humanity or personhood. But we need to teach children that they have autonomy, and that means we have to respect that autonomy as well. And there's a lot of things that I was taught, you know, like to hug my uncle, to kiss my auntie, that I didn't necessarily want to do just because I was shy. It wasn't really anything to do with about them. But when you're told something like that, the message that you're being given is actually your discomfort is not as important as making sure that that adult gets what they want from you.
Yeah.
And children do not have the capacity to take that kind of idea in a nuanced way. I mean, it's never actually an acceptable thing to teach a child. But if you're taught that in that circumstance that is a little bit more benign, it makes sense then that when I was behind those soundproof doors with this woman, like on the ground, that I was going to think the same thing. And I think that's really important, not just that example, but all examples of teaching children that they have autonomy and that their feelings are always more important than being considered like a good child. That's really important. We need adults to understand what a traumatized child actually looks like. I think there's a lot of different ways that represents itself. Sometimes a child will actually go out of their way to be like better in school, to be even more good because they're scared, and that's how they're coping with it. But other times children will become really like naughty and be acting out in ways that might be punished, but they're actually signs that they're calling out for help. There's lots of different ways it can manifest. Adults also need to know what a perpetrator of abuse can look like. It's not just about understanding what a child is doing, but also like, I'm sure that when I walked around in public with this woman, I looked really uncomfortable. And maybe it's just how I look back on it, but I think that she maybe looked a little bit smug. Like, I think she knew, I don't know, I don't understand her mind at all.
Yeah.
But like, people need to be able to question adults in a way that is not, you know, being really hypercritical of everyone all the time, but that if something seems inappropriate, that's a question mark. I think we also need to better design the worlds that we make for children. Like, there should never be a child in a soundproofed room by themselves with an adult. It actually doesn't matter who that adult is.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different things that we could be doing. And that also means like teaching adults how to respond to concerns that a child might be being abused, as well as how to respond when they've actually had a disclosure. So many adults don't believe children when they disclose abuse, and the foundation has data on it. So many people just don't believe children and think that they must be lying or they must have misunderstood something. That's abhorrent. And so from the very beginning to prevention to actually what has happened and what needs to happen once abuse has already occurred, a lot needs to change.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those things that people want to think it's not happening, so they're trying to potentially, think that they've misunderstood the child, or that the child is, using their imagination in a strange way rather than really validating what they're saying.
But I think child sexual abuse is so foreign to the world of a child. There's like, what would I have been making up, Yeah. And there were adults who didn't believe me when I disclosed. And that's like such a punch in the gut. But also it's just like, what am I doing it for? There's no gain to come from disclosing abuse. And so I think adults really need to check themselves on that.
Yeah, definitely.
This episode is dedicated to Australian Childhood Foundation, a not-for-profit that I am proud to be an ambassador for. The foundation exists to help children and young people heal from the trauma of abuse, family violence, and neglect. It's hard to hear, but there are over 530,000 reports of child abuse each year in Australia. Abuse affects children throughout their entire life, especially if they don't get the support that they need. Australian Childhood Foundation works to stop the cycle of abuse through specialist trauma counselling and programs. If you would like to support the foundation and the incredible work they do, visit childhood.org.au and make a donation.
I think that consent was something that I didn't really learn about when I was younger. In hindsight, maybe at all. Like, I just feel that conversations around sex were so different. I'm 31, so I finished school 15 years ago, which is, it's a while ago now. But so when we were, we'd have health or sex education, it was very basic. And I feel like it was also, sex was sort of painted out as this scary, negative thing. It was kind of like, don't do it. And if you do it, use protection and be safe. But otherwise it wasn't spoken about that much. And then consent was maybe touched on, not that much. But then especially consent around, kissing or touching or like holding someone's hand, or like you said before, kissing someone on the cheek, like an auntie or an uncle, or hugging a parent's friend. You were just expected to do that. And I remember being in situations where they'd be like, you can have your cupcake when you give me a hug, or
like, that's so messed up.
Isn't
when you
it?
think about
when
it.
you think about it,
seems
yeah.
benign, but it's actually really creepy.
It is, yeah. I have seen some parents do a really good job with this, where they'll be like, you don't have to hug, you can, fist bump, or you can wave, or you can, give a thumbs up. What do you think are some other strategies people can use to stop those awkward situations from happening?
I think it can definitely be challenging for adults if they're like the first in their adult community to want to change how they're teaching consent and autonomy to kids. The pressure to be like, actually, no, grandma, she doesn't have to hug you. Like, that is going to cause some tension, I think, in some families. But it's really important. And I think the only way to do it effectively is to explain why it's happening, and that it's actually not a personal thing. It's not just about that person. It's about teaching a child more broadly. And what you were saying about like sex education in school, I think for a lot of kids, that's the first time that they're really thinking about what sex is. And that means for some children, that might be when they're first considering that what they experienced that they had been trying to not think about was a form of sexual abuse, because you're learning about it in a way that you're supposed to be learning about it, like between two consenting adults. And then there are similarities to your experience. And I think that needs to be changed. There's been some amazing changes to how consent is going to be taught in schools, thanks to people like Chanel Contas and all of their work. But I think it's really important that it starts really young. And people are like, oh, in kindergarten, they shouldn't be hearing about sexual abuse. That's awful. It's going to, you know, corrupt their innocence. Nothing corrupts a child's innocence more than being abused. And there are ways to do it that are appropriate and that aren't going to traumatize children unnecessarily. But it has to be done because children need to know that it does not matter who this person is. Always their comfort is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I think you can start that from the moment a child is born. Like, it doesn't have to always be verbal. It's the way you physically engage with children as well and consider them the way you'd consider another adult. Like, we don't engage with children in a way that we do with adult people. It's the same way we engage with animals. Like, even our pets, we just like pick them up, we do whatever we want with them. We don't necessarily view them as these individuals that might have their own wants and interests and needs. And I think across the board, everyone deserves that.
That's so true. And I don't think I've ever thought about it that way, that you don't just go up to a random adult and like hug them, but people do that with kids.
Like, oh, you're so cute, let me do this and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Why would we be doing that? I mean, the only exception I can think is when adults touch pregnant women's bellies, and that's also so weird.
It is so weird.
And that also needs to go.
Definitely. I have a few pregnant friends at the moment and they've said it's so bizarre the way that people just think that they can touch you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really icky. This isn't on our question list, but questions pop into my mind as we go. And you don't have to go into detail, but I would really love to know, once you did disclose what happened to you and you had adults that did listen to you, what did that look like moving forward with, you know, therapy and getting you into a better headspace?
I think having people outside of me validate that experience, I couldn't have recovered to the degree that I have if that hadn't happened, because I really felt like I was losing my mind. I was having, every night I would have awful nightmares that related to and replayed that abuse. I'd wake up in like a cold sweat every single morning, and I really felt like I was kind of disconnecting from everything. And so if I hadn't had adults come in and be like, that is so awful, I'm so sorry, I think I would have just kind of gone further and further off the deep end. I was really lucky to have, you know, a family that could financially afford for me to see a psychologist and see a psychiatrist and for me to be medicated. That's something that so many people don't have. Like, the lack of mental health care access that people have is appalling. But I think to a certain degree, you have to be willing to like confront what happened to move past it, and you never fully move past it. I'm never going to be someone who's like, that's in the past, it doesn't impact me. That's just not how it is, I don't think. But you have to sit in it to be able to process it. And I think so many times I felt like I've really processed it, and then something else comes up and there's this whole other layer that I hadn't considered, particularly as you get older and you do start having sex and you do start having relationships. It impacts so many different parts of your life. It impacts your self-worth hugely, because I think if someone can treat you as though you're so disposable that it doesn't matter how that feels to you so long as they get what they want from you, like, how does that not make you feel worthless? And that's something that I think is probably what stays with me the most, that I have to really actively try to ignore. I probably think it's why I work so much. It's like where I derive my worth from, which is not necessarily good. But yeah, you have to like confront those things, even when they're things you really don't want to confront. It means that when I was like 16 or 17, I went into a psych ward like freely. I chose to, on the advice of my psychiatrist, and I was specifically there to confront everything because I was so angry. I had so many feelings that I actually was sick of having and that I needed to let go of. And so I went in and I wrote a letter to the person who abused me. That was like my task. And it took a really long time. It was really difficult. But writing that letter that was obviously never sent, it's like the most aggressive version of myself is that letter. But in having that like come out of me, it was such a huge weight off me. And I think that a lot of people hold that weight. Like with this survey that we've done with Australian Childhood Foundation, where we listen to all these survivors and we ask them what would have helped to keep them safe from sexual abuse, a lot of people say, like, this is the first time I've ever spoken about this. And that includes people who are like 70 years old. And that really makes me so sad, because I can't imagine the pain that I still have. I can't imagine how significant it would be and how much it would hang over me if I had never been able to tell anyone about it and I'd never been able to process it. And so I think this kind of collective discomfort we have around talking about child sexual abuse, like, I'm very open about it. I tell people about it if the moment is right. I don't just declare it. And you always see people's face kind of contort, and they want to do the right thing and they don't know how to respond. And we just need to be able to like sit with trauma, not just this, all kinds of trauma, and have it not be this thing that you keep quiet because it's uncomfortable for other people. Like the abuse is more uncomfortable than what anyone will ever feel just listening to it. And I think we can't address this problem unless we're really willing to sit in it.
Back on that, I would love for you to enlighten people. You know, from the Australian Childhood Foundation, they talk about the impact that child sexual abuse has on people if they do not get the intervention that they need when they need it. What does that look like? What does someone's life look like when they have been abused and they haven't been helped?
I just talked about my personal experience even with having help, but there are so many statistics that, the government releases and that are peer reviewed that show that people who survive child sexual abuse are more likely to have economic hardship. They're more likely to have difficulty with alcohol abuse and substance abuse because it's like a form of coping. They're so, like, you want to numb yourself from what's happening. You're more likely to be depressed. You're more likely to have a lot of different mental health issues. You're more likely to experience further abuse in your life. And I think that ties back to this sense of worthlessness. Like, even when I worked as a model, I got sexually abused in a much smaller way, but I was like inappropriately touched by a photographer. And of course you're going to be, if you haven't been able to kind of really comprehend that you don't deserve that. And I think I have had like a lot of sexual experiences where I hadn't worked that out yet. So there's a lot of things around that. There are even physical health problems that you're more likely to deal with if you've been sexually abused. Like the number of different ways you're more likely to get divorced. You're more like the number of things that you're more likely to experience is so immense. And it's because it's such a fundamental breaking of a person at an age where they're supposed to be being built up. And I think that that's why it's so important for us to try to prevent it. I think, there's a lot of work now to try to support survivors, and that's obviously critical. But ideally, we want more work, and I don't think there's enough work to make sure there aren't future survivors. And that's what I'm really interested in. I want survivors today to have support, but I want to make sure that there's not 1 in 3 children who are girls and 1 in 5 boys being sexually abused now and tomorrow and the day after that. And so the work that I do with the foundation is in that part.
Can you tell me more about that? So in 2022, Australian Childhood Foundation launched Emma's Project.
Yes.
Which is your project. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So Joe, the CEO, named it Emma's Project very nicely. And now, with the help of a lived experience committee that I chair with other survivors of child sexual abuse, we've renamed it to Our Collective Experience Project. I think that's really important because it isn't just me in this project. And like I mentioned, so we started with this survey of 360 survivors who gave us so much wisdom and so many insights into what it looks like to prevent child sexual abuse based on how they know they were failed. And we've looked at that. I read every single answer 3 times. It was a lot of work. And from that, we've written a report and we have key findings in it about what children needed, and we have a recommendation. And so the key findings kind of relate to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier. Children need adults to actively come to them and to come to them with help, to be interested in their lives, to ask them questions. They need adults to know that a perpetrator could be anyone, it could be someone who they trust. And there's a number of different findings. And the last one is that survivors want to be involved in helping to prevent further child sexual abuse. And that's really fundamental to what this project is. And the first recommendation of that report is that the Working with Children check, which is what everyone needs if they work with children, we want to include mandatory child abuse prevention education as part of the process to receive that check. And that would cover the things I talked about: understanding prevalence of abuse, supporting autonomy, signs a child might show, signs a perpetrator might show, how to respond to suspicion, how to respond to disclosure. And that's so important because I think people who don't have a Working with Children check think it's a lot more than it is. So in Victoria, the government considers the act that check falls under as like one of the key pieces of child protection legislation. It doesn't work. The person who had one, who abused me, had one. And like millions of people just in this state have one. And if you want to work at a bar, you need a responsible service of alcohol certificate. You have to complete hours and hours of education, and then you need to pass a test to be able to pour a beer at a pub to an adult.
Yeah.
You don't have to learn a single thing or pass any test to be trusted to work with children.
Yeah, I've had the Working with Children check a few times.
It's
from
just
my
a
speech
police
pathology.
check.
It's literally just to make sure you haven't committed any crimes, really.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people haven't.
And I think the reality is that check is never going to prevent people with the intention of abusing children from working with children. That's the way that people who abuse children are. The best the check can do is arm every single other adult with the tools that they need to prevent that abuse from occurring. And so that's what we want to have happen.
In addition to implementing mandatory training with the Working with Children check, are there any other legal measures that you think should be implemented?
Yes. So as well as the check, we want that mandatory education to be something that everyone who works with children has to do. So for example, like in Victoria, if you're a teacher, you don't necessarily just have the check. You have to go through the Victorian Institute for Teaching and you have a separate registration. So we want all of those registrations to have mandatory education. We're starting in Victoria, but we want everyone nationally who works with children to have that mandatory education. And there's also a lot of different issues around the Working with Children check not being nationally harmonised. So there's lots of things, and this is the first thing we're focusing on, but we plan to release at least another 2 reports based on everything that we've learnt from survivors, and each of those reports will have another recommendation to make sure that we really effectively change this. I think also a lot of the work that the government has done to try and prevent child sexual abuse since the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child abuse, which I took part in, a lot of it has been around just like general awareness raising. And that's important, but you can't necessarily measure the impact of that. I think we need to move into really measurable outcomes where we know like these people now understand this, these children now have these safety measures in place, really kind of based on survivor wisdom, able to be measured, able to like actually see, is this making a change, rather than just like, yeah, people know more about child abuse now, which isn't going to cut it.
Yeah. And what can people do to help as well?
So if people go to Australian Childhood Foundation's website and to the Our Collective Experience Projects page, we actually have a email form that people can sign. You can send a letter that's either pre-written or you can write your own, and it goes directly to the ministers that are in charge of child protection, education, and the Working with Children Check Act, and ask them to make that mandatory education something that is required, and for them to make that reform happen quickly, because every day that it isn't in place is another day that children are unsafe, and this isn't going to completely fix it, but it's a really easy step that the government can take that has a really significant impact. So the more people that put their weight and their words behind that, the better it's going to be.
We'll put the link in the show notes for that, for sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. I would love if you could take me back, or you could go back to young Emma. If there was some advice that you could give her, what would that be?
This is actually a question we asked in the survey. Like, what would you say to your young self? And so many people, I can't remember the actual percentage, but so many people just said it's not your fault. And that made me cry when I was reading it, because it was just again and again so many people saying it, which I think is really special, even if it's really sad. And so I would say that, but I would also say that, you know, this idea that I was a good girl, I didn't have to hold on to that. And that was never the most important thing about me. And I was always going to be loved and always deserved love, no matter what I did. And so, you know, my comfort should always be what mattered to me the most.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, on a bit of a lighter note,
Yes.
a little segment called Oranges and Lemons.
Yes.
It can be as trivial or serious as you like.
Mm-hmm.
If we can start with a lemon, something not so positive, and then finish with an orange, that would be lovely.
Well, not much has happened today except for talking to you yet, because it is the morning. I think when I was thinking about it, I think that I was going to say this conversation is like lemon and orange juice in a way. Like, it's hard. It makes me uncomfortable, but it's also something that I'm so grateful to be able to do, and I think it's so important to do. So it's both. But to have an additional orange, you also got me a matcha, and that was nice.
Oh, that's a nice orange. And you're very welcome. My lemon is that I am teetering on the edge of having tonsillitis, which you might be able to hear in my voice. It happens whenever I'm a bit run down, so I need to just like take a chill pill. So it's a sign for that. And then my orange is that I saw hot air balloons this morning from my apartment window.
When that happens.
It's the best. And they've been MIA for a while. And I run to the living room when I see the sunrise, like through my bedroom window. I run out every morning
to check.
And they haven't been there. I know, I'm like a child. And they were there today, and it just made my day. So that's my orange. But that's also nice. Talking to you, having you here has been so good. You are very inspiring, so well spoken. I cannot get over the fact that you're only 24 years old. I think you just have so much ahead of you that's going to be amazing to watch. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Where can our listeners find you?
So they can find the foundation at Australian Childhood Foundation, as like just Google it. Mm-hmm. Also Oz Childhood on Instagram, and me on Instagram is Hakame, which is a made up thing. So it's spelled HAKAMME.
Okay. And also, though, you've written a book, 2 books?
2 books and another one coming out in April.
And there's 2 documentaries you've also been involved in?
Yes.
Plug them. Go on.
So I also run a charity called Collective Fashion Justice. It's about the industry putting people, our fellow animals, and the planet before profit. So there's documentaries that are a part of that charity. One of the books, Total Ethics Fashion, is a part of that charity, funds the charity, and it's kind of like the manifesto for what we do and what we're working towards. I coined the term Total Ethics Fashion. My first book is called How Veganism Can Save Us. Unsurprising based on the title, I am vegan. And the next book that comes out is called Subhuman. And it kind of touches on what I was talking about earlier with like animals and children and how we treat them. It positions speciesism as a form of discrimination amongst other forms of discrimination, and looks at, you know, oppression really. And I think this is how my child abuse work and all of my other work connects. I view oppression and the refusal of autonomy as kind of just this consistent baseline problem, and I don't care who that is happening to, I want to fix it. And that book kind of explores that, and it also looks at the history of the animal rights movement, because it's super fascinating.
That's awesome. I can't wait to consume all of the things that you've created. Thank you so much for joining me, Emma.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tell Me More. This show wouldn't be possible without you. If you'd like to show your support, please subscribe or follow the podcast on your favourite platforms, and don't forget you can watch full episodes on YouTube and Spotify.